Thank you all for being here. We're so excited to have Jane Kennedy come back and talk about Irish immigration and labor in the Twin Cities area. But before I do our introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe at the Eastside Freedom Library.
Well, welcome everyone on behalf of the Eastside Freedom Library. We're delighted to continue working with the Ramsey County Historical Society in History Revealed, and this year's series, which is quite intentionally trying to bring stories from the margins and the corners and the shadows into the center of our awareness. I want to mention that on Tuesday, May 3rd, we will be hearing from a group of Macalester College geography students who have been researching this past year the history of the Ramsey County Poor Farm, and they will be presenting their findings. So please join us on Tuesday evening, May 3rd at 7, again via Zoom. I just want to encourage you all to visit the Eastside Freedom Library website, look at our calendar of upcoming events, most of which are on Zoom. But as we all hope that we've turned the corner into spring, we will be beginning to experiment with events on our front lawn, which is a great venue to build community and learn history. So I'll turn this back to my colleague, Robin Priestley from Ramsey County Historical Society.
Thank you, Peter. And again, we also appreciate all of you being here tonight for this program. I want to thank the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library for their support. We've been working together on this series of History Revealed programs for, I think it's 5 or 6 years now. And they've been great partners, and we very much appreciate their support as well as all of our member support. So these programs are made possible by our members. If you're interested in becoming a member of the Ramsey County Historical Society, you get some great benefits, including our quarterly magazine. And you can check all that out on our website, which is on the screen, www.rchs.com, and then check out the Eastside Freedom Library, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. You can see all of the upcoming programs, including the May 3rd program, and we have programs throughout the summer. We're going to have some great programs coming up. So just again, as a reminder, please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off, and you can put your comments and questions in the chat. And we'll read those out for Jane to answer later on. And then after the program, we'll be able to turn on our microphones and cameras after I stop the recording so we can share. The Ramsey County would like to acknowledge this sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, that's www.rchs.com, which includes actionable ways in which Ramsey County Historical Society pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. So we, as Peter mentioned, we are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community. And to that end, in 2022, we are working to bring you programs focused on our series, Making Minnesota, which will explore the often untold stories, histories, and experiences of some of the worldwide immigrant, African-American, and indigenous communities that make up Ramsey County, which is Minnesota's most diverse county. So to that end, we have Jane Kennedy talking tonight on Irish immigration and employment. Jane lives in St. Paul, and Her interest in exploring Irish immigration is linked to her family's immigration to the US in the 1880s from County Mayo, Ireland. Jane has a BA in English and journalism from St. Catherine University and an MA in business communications from the University of St. Thomas. Jane obtained Irish citizenship in 2016, a dual citizenship, following 2 visits to her grandfather's homeland in the, okay, I'm going to say this wrong, Jane, you're going to have to correct me, in the Belmullet Peninsula in County Mayo. Thank you, Jane.
Well, thank you very much, Robin, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. And I would like to begin my presentation with thank you to everyone again for being here. And I want to thank a lot of people who were very instrumental in helping me pull together a lot of the data and facts that you'll be hearing tonight. For me, this has been a journey, just learning more about what transpired for Irish immigrants coming from Ireland, predominantly in the early part of the 18th century and also in the middle part. And then what became of these immigrants and how did they succeed and prosper once they set foot in Minnesota and specifically Ramsey County and the city of St. Paul. Now, there were a lot of approaches I could have taken for this presentation, and really trying to find the right path was not an easy thing for me to do. It was very challenging because sometimes I ended up going down rabbit holes when it came to finding some meaty information about things, and only to find out that, okay, the rabbit hole kind of ended and I couldn't find anything else. And in other places, I found a lot of information that is going to spur me on to do more research in different areas. But anyway, I will save my thanks for later, but there's a few people in particular I want to thank who have met with me and assisted with my research. So let me begin by talking a little bit about who were the Irish immigrants and what was happening in their lives at the time. If you recall, the Great Famine took place between 1845 and 1852. Now, it affected the entire country of Ireland, but the parts that I'm most familiar with are the western part of the country, specifically County Galway, County Mayo. County Mayo, as Robin mentioned, is where my family came from. But in the middle of the 19th century, and then toward the end of the century, there was extreme poverty going on. People were dying because they were starving. And that was the result of a number of things that were happening in the country at the time. We're all familiar with the potato famine. We know about what happened with the potato. But there were other things going on as well. The people that were the Irish men and women who were trying to farm the land were ruled by the British. They had, the Irish had very small plots of land. As the potato crop was failing and other things were going awry, they were having a hard time meeting their rent payments. And so their homes were being destroyed when they couldn't meet their rent payments. And if you look in this picture on the left, this shows some British troops coming and breaking the house and making the people flee from their home.
Hey, Jane, I'm sorry. Jane, I'm sorry. We can't see your slides right now.
Oh,
can you share them again?
Okay, hold on. Yep, let me go back and share. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, thank you, Robin. All right, so I'm sorry, I was only on the second slide here. Okay, so, all right, so what you can see here, oops, hold on. Hopefully you can see if I can move this a little, this panel. So what's happening here in this slide is that, again, let me just point out that the British came and were forcing the Irish people out of their homes and destroying their homes so they couldn't go back and enter their homes because the Irish were not able to pay their rents to their landlords. And again, this is a woman sitting out on her table after having been put out of her home. Oftentimes what happened was the doorways of the homes were, the British would brick the doorway so that people could not enter. So this is what was going on in the famine, during the famine years in the 1800s. And this is what was causing people to flee Ireland to come to the United States. So let's take a quick look at some of the population information here on this particular screen. Now, it's important to note that the rivers and railroads often defined boundaries as well as where family members settled in the state. The peak period of immigration from Ireland was 1846 to 1854. During these years of famine, 1.3 million Irish immigrated to the United States, an average of 173,000 people per year. There was a financial panic that started a depression in the United States, which after the 8th year, family flight slowed Irish immigration greatly. And then in the 1860s, the Civil War was raging. And at that point then, only an average of 69 Irish people per year were arriving in this country. Specifically in Ramsey County, we can take a look at this chart now. We can see what's happening. The decades 1870, 1880, 1890. In these particular decades, Ramsey County was standing out in every one of these early decades as the Minnesota county with the highest numbers of Irish, who were consistently a larger percentage of the aggregate than in the rest of the state. So take a look at some of these numbers here, beginning with 1880. You can take a look and see that of the Twin Cities total in 1880, they made up 14% of the state total, and yet the Twin Cities Irish born were 22% of the state total. And if you go all the way down to the right in 1910, you'll notice again what the numbers look like. In this case, 27% of the Twin Cities total were people from the Twin Cities out of the entire state. In the meantime, the Twin Cities Irish-born total amounted to 46%. So that's quite high. It just shows how many people of Irish descent were living in the Twin City area. But as political and economic conditions in Ireland improved, significantly fewer Irish immigrants were coming to the United States. And by 1940, only 4,219 natives of Ireland, and that includes Northern Ireland and the Free State, lived in Minnesota. But by 1970, the number decreased to 1,003. All right, now I'd like to move and start talking about some of the different occupations of the Irish people. And I would like to start out with the St. Paul Police. And so in 1854, St. Paul was incorporated as a city, and the police department became a recognized agency. Now, so in 1858, just 4 years after the St. Paul Police Department became an agency, the first human rights complaint was filed. So just imagine, just 4 years later. At the time, there was the police chief and 11 patrolmen. Let's see who those patrolmen were. Well, there were 6 Irish, 3 American, and 2 French. There were no German officers, and the German residents of the city wanted to lay off some of the 11 to be replaced with German police officers. The mayor at the time was Norman Kitson, and he said something to the effect, "I do the hiring, I do the firing." He ignored the pleas from the German to add German patrolmen to the force. You can tell from the mayor's comment that obviously there was no job protection in those days. And I want to add that for the patrolmen working during this time, every time a new administration would come in, and sometimes that was as frequently as every 2 years, the patrolman could be let go and then brought back again when a different administration, a different mayor was brought in. So some patrolmen, even though they may have been the most effective and wonderful patrolmen out there, had a very bumpy road in terms of their career simply because they were dealing with a variety of different administrations that were doing the hiring and the firing. So let's take a look at some of St. Paul's early finest. See if I can move this up a little bit more. So the honor of wearing badge number 1 belongs to Philip Gibbons, who was detailed with a group called the Black Maria, and they were the group that made daily trips to the workhouse. Officer Gibbons was the oldest patrolman on the force, having been appointed in 1874 and having served continuously for 28 years. Now that's in spite of what I just told you about the penchant for a new administration coming in and hiring and firing. He bragged that during all the years he served the city in the capacity of a patrolman, that he had never been on the carpet for any violations of rules or neglect of duty. Despite all of the changes of administrations, Officer Gibbons always remained. Next, we have Patrolman John Lynch, who was detailed at the Margaret Street Station. He was born in Ireland and went to Boston when he was 14 years old. In Boston, he learned the bricklaying trade, which he followed for some years after his arrival in St. Paul. But then he was appointed a patrolman in October of 1880, and he belonged to the Central Station Detail until May 1887, when he was transferred to the Margaret Street Station. Next, we have the fine Irishman, James Carey, who was considered one of the best known officers in the city. He was part of the Broadway Squad, which was stationed on Jackson Street between 3rd and 4th. One of the requirements of this beat was a thorough knowledge of the different localities of the city. As each train brought a load of strangers into the city, the newcomers invariably got up as far as 3rd and Jackson Streets and then would tell Officer Carey where they wanted to go. He directed them with clarity and precision. And although Officer Carey was born in Scotland, he is a true Irishman. And I would say in Scotland, he learned the trade of stationary engineer, and it was a business he followed until he arrived in St. Paul in 1876. And then finally, we have Edward Delaney, who came to New York from Ireland while an infant. His father died when he was 5 years old, and Edward came to Elgin, Illinois, where he remained for 2 years, later moving to St. Paul, where he learned the carpentry trade. In St. Paul, he walked a beat at the Central Detail until 1892, when he joined the mounted squad at the Prior Avenue station. Okay, from police to justice. So this picture, and again, some of this was very new information for me as well. You probably know it, but it was somewhat new to me. This is a picture of Justice Thomas Wilson, who was born in County Tyrone, Ireland on May 26, 1827. He came to the United States when he was only 11 years old and moved to Minnesota in 1855, when he began practicing law in Winona. He was a district judge in Winona from 1857 to 1864, at which time he became Associate Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court. And from 1865 to 1869, he served as Chief Justice of the court. So think about the fact that he was serving as Chief Justice in 1865, and he had only been born in Ireland in 1827. And so in a matter of just a few decades, he had risen that far as an Irish immigrant. After his time on the state Supreme Court, the Chief Justice Wilson was elected a congressman from Minnesota's 1st District in 1886. A few years later, he ran unsuccessfully for governor of Minnesota. 2 years later, he served as general counsel for Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railroad, a position he held until his death at age 83. And let me not forget that he was also a U of M regent. He actually outlived his wife and daughter. Okay. So moving on. So Irish immigrants arrived in St. Paul with considerable baggage in the mid-19th century. And I'm sure this takes no one by surprise, but these were some of the ads that were running in the New York Post at the time. You'll notice, to save trouble, no Irish need apply. Or an American or English woman would be preferred. No Irish need call. Trying to break into the social web of St. Paul once Irish settled was a considerable challenge for many. For example, the Irish lacked capital, had to deal with negative Irish stereotypes that they encountered out east, and nativism was on the rise, particularly with a group called the Know Nothings in the mid-1800s. Now, the Know Nothings was a secretive organization established in 1854 aimed at discouraging Irish Catholics from immigrating. Members, of course, feared that a large Catholic population would put the predominantly Protestant United States under the control of the Pope in Rome. The organization got its name from its clandestine nature. When asked about the parties, members would say, "I know nothing." Yet, in spite of these barriers and being outnumbered in St. Paul by both Germans and Scandinavians, the Irish rose to prominence. Though data revealed that the Irish fell economically behind the general population of St. Paul, even through the turn of the century, a small group of Irish succeeded in gaining a foothold of power and influence that was so strong, it turned St. Paul into becoming the Irish town. Let's look at a few political influencers. We'll start with Bishop Cretin first. Although born in France in 1799, Bishop Cretin ordained in the then Diocese of St. Paul in 1851. He wanted to colonize the area with Catholics by bringing Catholic immigrants from European countries to Minnesota. And this is what he said in 1852 already. "The Catholic vote is beginning to hold the balance in elections. They do not dare to disregard it." And this is in regard to the city of St. Paul. Meanwhile, we have William Pitt Murray, an Irish Protestant lawyer who was described as cut in the mold of an Irish politician. Murray claimed kinship with fellow Irishmen in St. Paul. By defending their Catholicism, he succeeded in delivering the immigrant Catholic vote in both local and state elections. A few notables about Mr. Murray: he was instrumental in creating Minnesota's first college. Can you guess what that was? Hamline University. And in 1885, he helped legally prepare for and secure the site of the Minnesota State Fairgrounds. Some of the city's Irish were able to partner with St. Paul's quote unquote old stock, thus allowing them to advance economically and socially. Christopher D. O'Brien, the mayor of St. Paul from 1883 to 1885, along with two of his brothers, including Thomas, who you see here, were lawyers and considered to be of, quote, traditional Irish type, unquote. This references those trained in the English-controlled courts of Ireland who learned from the British how to manipulate the legal system. These Irish lawyers were considered to be silver-tongued and quick-witted. As for the O'Brien brothers, Thomas went on to become Associate Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court. Irish-born lawyers in Minnesota and St. Paul didn't make up a large percentage of lawyers in general, But in relation to lawyers of foreign stock, numbering 105 in 1880, 20% of the state's foreign-born lawyers were Irish, as were 35% of St. Paul's. While this mixing of some educated Irish with the city's old stock propelled some Irish to lofty positions, many other Irish immigrants remained mired at the bottom of the economic ladder. However, you will see St. Paul has a wonderful history of having Irish mayors, of electing Irish mayors. So, if you look at the rankings here, you'll see that as early as 1878, we had the first Irish mayor in St. Paul, who came from County Cavan in Ireland, and again, an immigrant coming here and becoming mayor of the city. And again, Christopher O'Brien, also from Ireland, County Galway, also serving as mayor for 2 terms, starting in 1883. And then we see this wonderful list of additional mayors all the way up through our pretty recent mayor, Chris Coleman, who served for 12 years from 2006 to 2018. So who are some of these Irish mayors? Let's take a look. Well, I already mentioned Mayor Christopher O'Brien. We also have Mayor William Mahoney. William Mahoney was a pressman by trade and a socialist and labor politician. He was born in Chicago in 1869 and died in St. Paul in 1952 at the age of 83. In his long and active life, Mahoney was president of the St. Paul Trades and Labor Assembly and was editor of the St. Paul Union Advocate newspaper and the prime mover of the organization of the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party. Next, we have William Dawson Sr., who was the founder of Gladstone. And those of you who are familiar with East Side, this is the area near current day Frost Avenue and English Street in Maplewood. He was born in Ireland in 1825 and arrived in St. Paul in 1861 to become a banker. Mr. Dawson also organized and became president of the Bank of Minnesota. Who are our other mayors? Well, again, we have Mayor Chris Coleman, Mayor Joseph Dillon, who served in the early 1960s, Mayor Edward K. Delaney, and Mayor John J. McDonough. Now, he worked as a lawyer and served in the Minnesota House of Representatives for 5 terms before beginning in 1925. While he was nonpartisan, he was well known for fighting prohibition and held a mixture of conservative legal beliefs, but liberal political ones. He was elected mayor of St. Paul in 1940, and in 1946, he suffered a stroke, which left him largely paralyzed. He continued living, though, until 1962. Okay, I don't know if you can see this. Okay, sorry, some of this is hiding a little bit. Okay, so it says like Irish laborers dominated St. Paul in the late 19th century. In her book, Claiming the City, author Mary Lethard Wingard writes, construction was one area of enterprise where the Irish excelled, schooled as they were as human steam shovels in cities across America. Though St. Paul's Irish population traveled a rough road toward to upward mobility from their jobs as low-paid construction laborers, those who managed to acquire trade skills found an opportunity for advancement. In 1880, 43% of St. Paul's laborers were Irish, while only 20% of the city's workers overall were in that occupation. A decade later, even at the turn of the century, Irish were still employed in large numbers as laborers at about 30%, where the city's average had decreased to about 15%. About 1/3 of the Irish-born workers were craftsmen, foremen, and skilled laborers at the end of the 19th century. A similar proportion of the first and second generations held these jobs in 1900. The Irish in 1880 in St. Paul were well represented in such jobs as boarding house keepers, launderers, express company employees that involved moving articles from one place to another, and masons. At the turn of the century, the Irish ventured into work as clerks, watchmen, firemen, policemen, and railroad workers. Some Irishmen in the building trades became important contractors and suppliers of building materials. Three prominent Irish families at the time were the Butler brothers, the Shealy family, and Foley Construction. Okay, all right, so let's take a look at the Butler brothers. Butler Brothers Construction was one of, if not the main contractor of the state capitol. Construction began in 1896 and was completed in 1907. The patriarch of the family was Patrick Butler Sr., and he was born on St. Patrick's Day, 1823, in County Wicklow, Ireland, and immigrated to the United States in 1852, first settling in Pennsylvania. Then he moved on to Galena, Illinois in 1853. It was there he met his wife, Mary Ann Gaffney, who he would, obviously he met his wife. She was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1830 and immigrated to the United States with her parents in 1848. The Butlers had 9 children total. The family moved to Minnesota in 1856, where initially Patrick taught school. A year later, the family moved to Lakeville in Dakota County and began the family's long involvement with farming. But the children's 5 sons, while they grew up on the farm, they did not want to keep farming. And so they all moved to St. Paul. This is where they were involved in what became Butler Ryan and then Butler Brothers Construction Company. And now I want to share with you a short clip about the Butler Brothers' involvement in the building of the state capitol. Oopsie. Oh. Oh, well, maybe not. Oh dear. All right, let me try one more time here. Oh, okay, I'm sorry about that. Let me just, Oh, here you go, okay. All right.
Jane, there's no sound.
Oh dear, okay. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I think it may be because I'm wearing these headphones and I'm having problems with the sound. But anyway, the bottom line is the Butler brothers were very involved in the construction of the Minnesota State Capitol in terms of construction. And in this slide, what I'd like to do is talk about several of the Butler children. So among the children were Walter Butler, who was the oldest Butler brother and the first president of Butler Brothers Construction Company. the general contractor for the construction of the Capitol. He began construction work as a bricklayer. Next, we have, and I'm only going to talk about 3 of these, but next is Pierce Butler. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Pierce Butler. He was the 6th of the 9 children of the Butler family and a graduate of Carleton College. He was admitted to the bar in 1888. Pierce practiced law in St. Paul and held several elected positions there. He also worked for the Butler Brothers Construction Company as its legal counsel. In 1923, he was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he served until his death in 1938. And then also Emmett Butler was the youngest of the Butler brothers, and he held the positions of manager of the Butler's Mesabi Range mining operations, general manager of the Butler Brothers Construction Company, and he eventually became president in 1936. Okay, I'm going to try to, at this point, I'm going to remove my headset. And Robin, if you could tell me if you can hear this, because I have another clip that I want to show. And I just think that you're not going to be able to hear it if it's because of my headset. So I'm going to take my headset off. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so many skilled Irish workers in St. Paul were fortunate that they were hired by Irish city contractors. This was the case for Joseph Sheely, who went to work for the Butler brothers when he was only 16. At age 25, he became a supervisor at the Great Northern. In time, with $1,000 in capital, Sheely established a sand and gravel company in St. Paul, along with his brothers, that resulted in a lucrative business that continues today. Mr. Sheely's firm was involved in the construction of the state capitol, which was no small feat. The Herculean task involved transporting 30 to 40 ton marble blocks from St. Paul's railroad station, the St. Paul Depot, to the Capitol. Now keep in mind that at the time, the roads in St. Paul were not at all like they are today. Although, okay, maybe they didn't have potholes, I don't know. But the roads were not roads really. And the Capitol approach was basically nothing more than soft sand. Sometimes it took as many as 80 horses to move a single block. Nearly all the materials used for the construction of the state capitol, the cathedral, and the post office in St. Paul were transported under Sheely's watch. In 1940, Joe Sheely was chosen to be St. Paul Winter Carnival's King Boreas. Here's what he had to say to an NBC radio network reporter during the big parade.
How did you become king? Well, Graham, when you left here 17 years ago, the Irish ran the town at that time. We have an Irish mayor now. The committee was made up of Kennys and Crowleys and Dickies and Murphys and Kellys. And it was no accident, Graham, that they did elect an Irish king.
Okay, so let's take a look at this quote. We can here. Just move this around a little bit from the Irish Standard in 1906. So 2 generations ago, the Irish immigrants did the work upon the streets, in the sewers, and upon the railways. The Italian immigrant today is doing what the Irish immigrant did 50 years ago. What has become of the children of the Irish immigrants? The question is easily answered. They have moved up in a country blessed with many opportunities, where all are given an equal chance. The physically and mentally strong children of hardy immigrants have easily succeeded in successfully competing with the children of the native born in the professions, in the trades, and in business. And interestingly enough, the article goes on to say that 50 years from now, the same will be found true of the Italians, perhaps even to a greater degree. Now, this is the Irish Standard saying that, and it ends by saying, the Italian is especially fitted for business pursuits. Sorry, okay. And then a quote from Anne Reagan in her book, The Irish. They were, as one scholar has written, the pioneers of the American urban ghetto. Although the famine brought many Irish to the United States, few chose to head far off to the Midwest. The expanse of farmland that Minnesota and its neighbors offered didn't appeal to the Irish immigrants who had enough of crop failures. In addition, they were used to small segments of farmland, not at all like the large farms prevalent in western and southern Minnesota. Furthermore, they lacked the capital that it would take to acquire these farms. So now just briefly moving into the logging industry, there were regular sailings of timber vessels between Canada and Ireland's shipbuilding ports during the 1820s and 1830s. The ships that journeyed westward carried timber as well as immigrants. In a book published in 1949 in Minnesota and written by author Agnes Larson, she notes that early loggers didn't come as part of groups. Rather, they brought their families with them because that's how they wanted to settle. They wanted to set up their homes here. Some may have been engaged in farming as well, but that work was secondary to their logging. While most loggers came from New England, Larson writes that many of the loggers were also French, Scotch, Norwegian, and German. But she did have this to say about the Irish. She noted that many of them went on to become foremen. Now, if you're from the East Side, even a long time ago, you'll know that the East Side was famous because it had the Hams brewing plant on the East Side. In fact, it was near an Irish settlement, which I will talk about in a little bit. The Hams Brewing Company was located on the East Side within blocks of where the Connemara's had settled in 1892. In addition, St. John's Catholic Church, the city's Irish church on the East Side, was just a few blocks from the brewery. The brewery was founded by Theodore Ham in 1865, himself a German immigrant. In a short time, the St. Paul location covered 4 acres on St. Paul's East Side. It's very certain that there were a number of Irish workers employed there. Now I'd like to switch from, I've been talking mainly about the men, the Irishmen that came here, and now I want to switch that up and talk about the female Irish, the women Irish. So the matriarchs of the Anglo-American family and the female Irish immigrant were said to have formed a symbiotic relationship. So if you see here on the slide, what was happening was the Anglo-American matriarch at this time in the middle of the 19th century was able to pursue education, reform, and other Victorian ideals, while, of course, the female Irish immigrant was the domestic help cleaning the matriarch's homes. But for the female Irish immigrant, she was able to provide for herself and even to the point of being able to send money back to Ireland. Whether the Irish were working as maids, chambermaids, cooks, waitresses, or in the laundry, the female Irish domestic became the face of the Irish for many Americans. Working in these occupations allowed the Irish women not only to learn middle-class values, but how to conduct themselves socially as well. Meanwhile, by hiring the Irish help, the Anglo-American women raised their status. Even families of limited social means were hiring household help to help enhance their social status. Many Irish females began as teens, and their work included cleaning rooms, meal prep, cleaning chamber pots. I did not show an image of that. Answering the door, responding to the employer's calls, running errands, and caring for children. To think that just the task of laundry back then included hauling and boiling water, keeping a fire going in the wood stove, scrubbing, wringing, drying, and ironing. So think about all the work that these poor women had to do. In addition, the Irish women faced loneliness and homesickness. That was all part of the package. And again, as I mentioned here, many Irish girls sacrificed so that they could send money home. Interesting, few of the Irish domestics' daughters took on these same positions as their mother. Rather, the daughters were more likely to become school teachers. Okay, take a look at this illustration. This shows a scene in a kitchen with a petite woman imploring her muscular Irish cook to continue in her duties. The cook shakes her fist in defiance. Now, American publications like Puck took aim at the invasion of Biddy, which was a nickname for Bridget, the female domestic servant. And there's quite a bit written about Biddy over the centuries of domestic help, when Irish were serving as domestic help. Unlike Punch and other British publications, which directed their ire at the Irish male and his militant doings, American publications and commentators took direct aim at the invasion of Biddy, the female domestic servant. The demands made on Irish men in Ireland that they accept the Union as a superior form of governance were similar to the demands that Anglo-American women placed on their female Irish servants, who were expected to recognize their subservient status and welcome their employers' attempts to civilize them. According to Richard Sutherland in his book, Americans and Their Servants, Domestic Service in the United States from 1800 to 1920, reaching its peak in the mid-19th century, prejudice against Catholic servants continued into the 20th century. It was said that Catholics could not be trusted. Catholic servants could not be trusted. They were spies of the Pope, sent to infiltrate American homes and to brainwash American children in a seemingly never-ending suspicion, but only because there were so many of them. The author goes on to say, Irish Catholics were accused of being dirty, greasy, uneducated, undisciplined, immoral, and a host of other unpleasantries. But they were not without their defenders, as the author Sutherland notes, saying the biggest plus for the Irish was their pleasantness. They were perfect butt servants. The stereotype of dirty, ignorant Paddy and Biddy were overshadowed by that of the genial, fun-loving lad and lass who attracted sympathy and won hearts wherever they went. Now, various jobs lumped together as needle trades provided Irish daughters and widows with an income. The occupation proved to be particularly appropriate for widows with small children in the 19th century. So much of the work was done on contract, and women could work at home while watching their children. And some of these children also were involved in some parts of this sewing, including maybe assisting with collars or buttons or sleeves or seams. Except for domestic service, sewing of various types was a popular choice of work for Irish women, here even in Minnesota. By 1900, women of Irish birth made up almost 34% of all seamstresses and dressmakers in the United States, and 41.2% of all white domestic workers. One of St. Paul's most famous Irish seamstresses was, that is my typo. It should be Mary Malloy. So I'm sorry for that. Mary was born in 1862 and went on to live a remarkable life due to her skills as a seamstress. Her parents were Irish immigrants who arrived in St. Paul in the 1850s. Mary was the third of 5 children. She began her craft at an early age and actually was able to be an apprentice to a woman, a Paris-born woman who had a dress shop in St. Paul. By the age of 17, Mary Malloy set up her own seamstress company, her own business in St. Paul in the Seven Corners area of St. Paul over on Exchange Street. Today, the Minnesota Historical Society's collection includes about 25 items crafted by Mary Malloy. Present-day seamstresses marvel at her work, including the stitches and handwork detail, as well as the attention to detail. Like other successful dressmakers, Mary employed other seamstresses to work for her. Labor was cheap and women worked long hours for very low wages. Mary Malloy's business at one time employed more than 20 seamstresses in the 1890s. Okay, I'm about ready to conclude my presentation, but I want to just say a few words about a group of people that came from basically County Galway, County Mayo in Ireland in the late, well, in actually in 1881. And again, these were people who were starving to death because of the, at that time it was called the Forgotten Famine. And working with Bishop Ireland of St. Paul, these people were brought from Ireland to come to find a new life, to get a new start on things. And these people ultimately, they came initially and settled in the town of Graceville in western Wisconsin, or excuse me, western Minnesota. But due to a number of factors, including the fact that by the time they got here, and they were in a very fragile, fragile state because of the starvation going on. They had traveled this very long journey from Ireland. They had come over by boat, by train, they had to take a wagon to actually get to Graceville. They were tired and they came in the middle of, they came actually well after planting season here in Minnesota. But due to a number of circumstances, they literally begged Bishop Ireland to let them come to St. Paul. Now, when they had taken the train, when they were coming here by train from Boston, they stopped in St. Paul to let off some of their teenage children, young boys and women, the women, again, going to work in domestic servant work or as seamstresses, and the boys going to work maybe in railroad jobs. And then the Connemars went on to Graceville. When they wanted to come back to St. Paul, mainly to be with their family and to find jobs in the city where they felt their skills were best matched. So today, just less than a mile from the eastern part of the downtown area is where they settled in an area called, today it's called Sweet Hollow. And it was quite the opposite of the plains of western Minnesota, where Bishop Ireland had them first established. And just a little bit more about St. Paul's Connemara Patch. It was located at the foot of an enormous bluff that frequently had flooding. The area was haphazardly laid out with irregular railroads. Tracks were spread throughout the area. And it was just really made up of tiny huts. And there was very limited space, not only between the huts, but between the huts and the railroad tracks. And there were a number of deaths of people who would literally walk out their door and get struck by a train. So my final slide is what became of the Connemara's. And this came from someone's journal that was found, this piece. So MMD, let's say it's Martin McDonald, with a family of only young children, shews how rapidly a poor man, even only a laboring man, can attain independence. At the cost of $70, he got himself a roomy house with good yard and shed for his cows. From the milk of these, and their grass cost him nothing, his wife, besides keeping the family in milk and butter, sells 8 quarts a day. The combined earnings of man and wife are sometimes over $60 a month. They have bought a lot for $500 and are on the high road to wealth. They educate their children too. Again, this is taken from someone's journal about what became of the Connamaras. So that concludes my presentation. I wanted to end it on a positive note because a lot of these people came to Minnesota, to St. Paul, in somewhat dire straits. And while many people never really got to some type of financial success, others did extremely well. But in looking at things over, it's hard to say what would have happened to many of these people had they stayed in Ireland during the famine. So I'd like to just conclude by saying this is just a component of my bibliography for this research work, and I would be happy to share that with anyone. And here's my contact information. So it's 7-j@msn.com. And before I close here, I would like to give a shout out to a couple of individuals. Ed Steenberg, who I think might be on tonight as part of this presentation listening. And Ed gave me some great information from the St. Paul Police Archives. And also to Kyle Sheely, who is from the Sheely family. And there is a great amount of research work that is available for people who are interested in contracting work and the part the Irish played in it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin and we'll see what questions are out there.
Thank you, Jane. This was a great presentation. There were a couple questions, one of which you answered. Brad was asking about the Irish and Sweet Hollow and the Connemara Patch. And thank you for that question, Brad. There is more on that topic on our YouTube channel, where Jane did a program in the summer of 2020 on the Connemara Irish. So check that out. But if there's anything you want to add in answer to Brad's question, Jane, before we move to another question.
Okay, and so I'm sorry, Brad, what was your original?
He was asking about the Irish and Sweet Hollow and Connemara Patch, which you addressed.
Okay, well, I would like to say that you know, I would really encourage you to go back and look at the recorded presentation I gave. There's a lot of sadness about the story of what happened when the Irish settled here in St. Paul, specifically in the Connemara Patch, just because, again, these people had been through so much already, and now they were forced to come and settle in another area. And where they settled at that time, in the patch was a very impoverished area, geographically especially, although it was located close to some easy employment. I think the people still had very, very difficult life, and it took probably years and decades before they could advance themselves into some mode of what they would call successful life.
And Peter reminded everybody, please put your questions and comments in the chat. And there was another question. Do you know, Jane, if William Mahoney was related to former state representative Tim Mahoney?
I do not know that, but I will say, I do believe there are many Mahoneys in this part of St. Paul, Minnesota. So there might be, I don't know for sure.
And Eileen answered a question about Pierce Butler's home on Summit at Oxford, that it's next to the governor's residence, which is the Irvine Mansion. So are there any other questions right now? Do you have a sense of what percentage of the Irish immigrants to Minnesota were women versus men?
I don't have that information. I would guess, I mean, based on what I've read, I would tend to think that it would be pretty equal in terms of male versus female.
We have a thank you, somebody wanting to learn about your ancestors and family's history. And I will put a link in the chat in a couple minutes for the Connemara Patch video. I just have to get my browser open and get that. Any other questions for now for Jane? Peter, do you have any questions?
Maybe, Jane, can you say, do you know more about Irish involvement in the labor movement in St. Paul?
I do not know that, but I will say one of the difficulties I had in doing my research for this is that I was desperate to find out information about many of the Irish men who worked for the railroad. And this was an occupation that my grandfather worked in. And I know that he worked with a number of Irish men, and Irish men worked in railroads, not only here in Minnesota, in St. Paul, but there were railroad men all over the United States. That was a significant occupation for many of the Irishmen that came here. And so beyond that, though, I really can't say more. It was very difficult finding any information. The only information about the railroads I've been able to find, and I've contacted the Railroad Museum in St. Paul, is that there are employee records available that you could look at, which I assume would basically tell you the name of the employee and their years of service. But again, that is going to be, going down a rabbit hole, because it's a lot of work, and what's the result? And I think I could be pretty certain that there were a significant number of Irish men working in the railroads at the time of the late 1800s, early 1900s, even into the mid 1900s.
Thank you.
Yes.
There was a question or a comment from Eileen that said that there were Irish who farmed in Minnesota and were successful. Is there something else you want to share beside the Connemara people who had a really difficult time?
Yes, and I would agree with Eileen that there were successful Irish farmers. And if, again, to go back to my original story about the Connemaras, when they were brought to Graceville to settle, they were put on 160-acre land to farm. Now, it took 5 years to be able to prepare the ground, the soil, for being able to use it for planting. It took, they could do like 5 acres, I believe, in 2 years. The bottom line, it was a very long time before all 160 acres were going to be usable for these farmers. And again, the Irish people were coming from very short, very small acreage farms in Ireland. And they, a lot of them just did not have the ability or the resources to be able to work on these large farms. And again, I agree with Eileen. That's not to say there weren't some successful farmers. There were some people from Connemara region who did stay out in Graceville, and there were a number of farmers, Irish farmers in southern Minnesota, around Shieldsville and Faribault and down in that area, that went on to become quite successful farmers as well.
There was also a question about the language, the Irish and Gaelic language. Did they bring the language with them when they moved, or did they learn English pretty quickly?
The Irish, bad news, good news, is that the Irish were forced to learn English back in Ireland in the 1820s. So the bad news is that they lost their language. The good news is that when they did immigrate to the United States, because they were able to speak English, they were able to get jobs that they might not otherwise have been able to get had it not been for them knowing the English language.
There was another comment about Mayor Mahoney was a socialist and a labor activist. So I don't know, Peter, if there's anything you want to share on questions, or Jane, if you want to share anything more about that.
Peter?
Well, Mahoney was a leader in the initial organization of the Farmer Labor Party in 1924. And as Jane said, was editor of the St. Paul Union Advocate, and a primary position of his campaign for mayor in 1932 was to turn what was, I guess, northern states' power to return it to being a genuinely publicly owned utility, which led to a lot of pushback against Mahoney in his short term as mayor.
So Kyle Sheely is here. Thank you, Kyle. Sharing more about the Sheely Company's early work was laying down the ballast for the Great Northern Railroad. And the location was on Snelling and Como. That came from Joe Sheely leasing that land near the Great Northern Railroad line between Pierce Butler and Energy Park Drive. So, but related to that, there was a question, does anybody know what happened to the co-named Mahoney Street in downtown St. Paul? It must have gotten either paved over or renamed, if anybody has any information on that.
Well, that had been Main Street. And I always thought that St. Paul had the shortest main street in the United States. And it was co-named Mahoney Street because the St. Paul Labor Center was located at 411 Main Street. I imagine that when the Labor Center was sold and torn down for the construction of the new Dorothy Day Center, that the co-name Mahoney Street probably faded away at that point.
Thank you, Peter. And Manley was sharing that John Ireland also promoted farming settlements at Belle Plaine and Henderson that were more successful. And as Jane mentioned, part of the problem with the County Mayo Irish was the timing of when they arrived was not conducive to success in the tough weather of Minnesota. Allison was wondering if there were neighborhoods, or did you have more to add, Jane? Or
I was just going to add to that. There was also an attempt to establish some Irish farming communities down in an area called Curry, Minnesota, in southern Minnesota. And again, that sort of met the same fate as the Connemara's in Graceville, where again, this big effort to bring the Irish to a farming community that was unfamiliar to them. And it sort of met with the same consequences, where it didn't bode well. Now, again, I'm not saying that there are not successful farming enterprises by Irish people in Minnesota, but there are several indications that things have gone bad for other efforts to farm.
Thank you, Linda. Yes, The Street Where You Live, A Guide to Street Names in St. Paul is a great book. And there's a section about William Mahoney Street in there. We do have a copy of that in our research center in the Landmark Center if you need to get a hold of that. And there were some questions about parishes in St. Paul, Jane. St. Patrick's Parish, St. Mark's Parish on Dayton Avenue had Irish parishioners. Did you want to share a little bit about the influence of the church on the Irish immigration?
Well, I would say
beside, of course, Bishop Ireland.
I would say that just from my own personal experience, and I'm sure many others who are listening to this presentation can relate as well, but growing up in the 60s and going to grade school, I was not only Irish, I also am German and also Polish. And so I walked home from school every day past my what could have been my Irish parish, but I was also German, so I went to the German grade school. And I think that was the case. People were, even in the 60s, people really stuck to the parish that was based on their heritage. And, it's a long story, I think, how I ended up at the German parish versus the Irish parish. But in those days, that's where people, at the turn of the century and on through the 60s, 70s, people stayed in those parishes based on their background.
And Eileen was saying that St. Mary's in Lowertown was considered an Irish parish in the 1860s when it was established. It's a beautiful church over there in Lowertown.
Mhm. Yes.
So thank you, everybody, for your questions. And thank you, Jane, for this great presentation. Again, we appreciate everybody being here and hearing from Jane Kennedy a second time about the Irish in St. Paul and Ramsey County. So